bring you greetings from the Oxford C.S. Society in Oxford, England. I live in Wisconsin, teach in Texas online, and I travel on my holidays every winter and summer to Oxford, where I spend my holidays. And when I'm there, I always go to the meetings of the Oxford C.S. Society. And so it's a group like yourselves, people meeting to discuss the works of Lewis and his friends. And I just really appreciate the kind of ethos that groups like these bring together. People coming together for fellowship, for conversation, for the life of the mind in companion with just having a nice time. And this lecture that I'm going to give you is adapted from one that I gave for the very first time at the Oxford C.S. Society. This is, in fact, the first American preview of my book, Tolkien's Modern Sources, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. So there you go. I'm writing this book for Kent State University Press. I've been working on it for about 7 years, and it is finally almost done. All being well, I will give it to my long-suffering editor in May of this year, and I'm hoping that it will be published either the end of this year or early 2020. So it is coming, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to share this with you tonight. Just one small sampling out of a very substantial book. And I do encourage you, I love Q&A, as the folks who have heard me the last 2 lectures are well aware, so I'm looking forward to a good discussion afterwards. So definitely do note your questions, and we'll talk about it. So, the title of my talk tonight comes from this forthcoming book, Tolkien's Modern Sources. And this may seem surprising to you. Tolkien's modern sources? Are there any? That's the question. Are there enough modern sources to do a talk about, much less write a whole book about? And the idea of Tolkien having modern sources seems strange to a lot of people at first. Both readers and, indeed, scholars and critics. Modern sources. Wasn't he a medievalist just through and through? Wasn't he somebody who thought that even Chaucer was the cutoff date, that anything past Chaucer was too modern? Short answer, no. This false idea, so yeah, was he only medieval? No. Are there modern sources? Yes. So this false idea of Tolkien as someone who, of course, disdained and avoided all modern literature, developed even during his lifetime. Somehow it seems as though people wanted to believe that the author of The Lord of the Rings lived in a world all of his own, stuck in the past. For instance, there are several interviews of Tolkien in which he actually corrects the interviewer in this regard. In one of these, the interviewer expresses surprise that Tolkien read the newspaper at all, and Tolkien replied that indeed he subscribed to 3 newspapers, adding, "I take a strong interest in what is going on, both in the university and in the country and in the world." As one example, in 1949, Tolkien co-signed a letter to the New York Times as one of the honorary vice presidents of the Newman Association. This letter protested the arrest of a Hungarian cardinal, and it was protesting the instance of Soviet influence in Hungary leading to violations of religious freedom. So here we can see the letter, and I have circled Tolkien's name being added to this letter protesting the Soviet aggression and Soviet violation of religious freedom. And this is not the sort of thing that you would expect from someone who is stuck in the past, not interested in the modern world. Now, this habit of oversimplification with regard to Tolkien's engagement with the modern world in general, and with modern literature in particular, was unfortunately reinforced by Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien. Carpenter, and then again by Tolkien's group biography of the Inklings. Carpenter sums up Tolkien's reading as follows. He writes, "He read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it." So Carpenter. And as Carpenter is to date the only biographer to have unfettered access to the Tolkien papers, Naturally, his statement carries weight. People have quite reasonably taken it at face value. However, Carpenter's statement is incorrect. It's simply factually incorrect. Tolkien did read quite a lot of modern fiction, as I discovered over the last few years of research. And he did take notice of it. And here we must recognize that Tolkien's first biographer was not an objective and unbiased reporter in this regard. Despite having compiled the letters and written biographies both of Tolkien himself and of the Inklings as a group, Carpenter showed very little appreciation of the Inklings' work, and he seems to have viewed them as out of touch with modern society, an attitude which may well have clouded his judgment of Tolkien's real attitudes. Indeed, in one interview, Carpenter admitted to beginning his biographical work with an approach to Tolkien as a caricature of the Oxford academic. That's Carpenter's own phrase. Carpenter describes his first draft as treating him as slightly slapstick. And these are Carpenter's own words. In another interview, Carpenter's asked, "Who of the Inklings do you think you'd have had the strongest rapport with?" His reply is telling. He says, "I don't think I would with any. One looks about at other groups that do exist still in Oxford and says, oh, there's that little clique in the corner again, chatting away and reading their own poems. No, I'm not the sort of person who goes in for that sort of thing. I suspect I would have been extremely rude about it at the time." So, this is the man who wrote the first biography of Tolkien. Now, I would venture to say that in making his assessment of Tolkien's reading habits for the biography, Carpenter was seeing what he expected to see, a backward-looking, out-of-touch academic who never read anything modern. But that's simply not what the evidence shows. Tolkien was, in fact, an avid reader, and it's a point rather charmingly attested to in one of his linguistic doodles. He frequently translated poems, prayers, and isolated phrases into Elvish, and in these notes include a sample in Elvish, the Elvish language of Kenya, which translates as, "I've spent over £100 on books this year, but I do not regret it at all." And this text appears in materials dated to the late 1920s. Counting for inflation, Tolkien's £100 would be the equivalent of approximately £6,000 or $8,000 today. And considering that Tolkien had full access to a superb collection of manuscripts and books at the Bodleian Library, at Pembroke, and later at Merton College, his book-buying habits surely included titles for his own personal reading, as well as for his scholarly pursuits. Tolkien's intensely creative and original mind was nourished by many sources. As he said of The Lord of the Rings, a story such as this grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. Tolkien noted in an interview that he was born with what you might call an inventive mind, and the books that have remained in my mind remain as the things that I acquired and don't really seem much like the book itself. So his modern sources, as well as his medieval and linguistic sources, were digested and assimilated in his creative imagination and integrated into the larger fabric of his creative work. So when we're looking at Tolkien's modern sources, we're looking at something real and substantial and significant. Recognizing Tolkien's modern reading helps us to understand his work better, and to understand better why The Lord of the Rings has been so powerful for so many readers. As Tolkien critic Roland Fleer puts it, his work could not have spoken so powerfully to his own century if he had completely succeeded in escaping it. The fact is that he could not escape, and was in actuality both responding to and using the most typical aspects of his own age as essential elements of his fantasy. Tolkien's creative work was a response to modernity that engages with the modern world, rather than simply rejecting it, and that draws upon both medieval and modern sources. And that, in short, is why we should be interested in what Tolkien read of modern literature. It helps us to understand The Lord of the Rings in particular, and his writing in general, and it helps us to gain a more well-rounded picture of Tolkien himself as a creative artist. In my book, I examine a wide range of authors whom Tolkien read. In my research, I have attempted to track down every bit of evidence for what he actually read. Now, note, not things that he might have read or could have read, because that's what people were reading at the time. I have restricted myself only to things for which we have evidence that he did read or that he did own a copy of. And I've done this by looking at his own writings, at the drafts of his writings, many of which have been now published in good editions, but certainly some that are still in the archives, by looking at his letters, by looking both published and unpublished as far as I could, looking at interviews that Tolkien did, some of which were never reprinted, but I've been able to find in archival collections, and looking at interviews with his family and his friends, because they may have mentioned books that their father read or knew. And collating all of these things has given me a picture, just a snapshot, but still a picture of what Tolkien read of modern works. And by modern, I'm getting cut up into 1850. And what this has shown me is that there really was a tremendously wide range, much more than I expected when I started this project. From fantasy and science fiction, to adventure stories, to poetry, tales of romance, to modern and indeed modernist literature. Authors such as George MacDonald, William Morris, H. Rider Haggard, John Buchan, David Lindsay, Lord Dunsany, Beatrix Potter, J.H. Shorthouse, Francis Thompson, and many more. And tonight, out of all these wealth of examples, we will consider some examples only from one chapter of my book, the chapter on children's literature, where we will see, hidden in plain sight, some of the sources of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. There's so much more that could be said in a single talk, of course, but I've chosen just those examples for tonight that show most strongly Tolkien's depth from these writers of children's fiction. In particular, tonight we'll be looking at 4 books, and they are, first, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs by E.A. Rick Smith, The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting. And this small selection of examples provides us with a glimpse of the way that Tolkien engaged with the popular literature of his time. Now, The Hobbit developed in the context of Tolkien's family as he first told the story to his children. We know from Tolkien's posthumously published works that The Hobbit was not the only imaginative work to emerge from his familial storytelling. We see, for instance, the elaborate and completely charming Father Christmas letters taking shape over many years. We have Roverandom, featuring the travels of an enchanted toy dog, including to the moon. And Mr. Bliss, whose title character has misadventures with a motor car. This was a literary family, not just in that Tolkien, as the children's father, was a writer of literature and a professor of English, but that the children themselves, and later grandchildren, read and were encouraged to read. Carpenter, Tolkien's biographer, notes that the Tolkien children were always provided with full nursery bookshelves. And Tolkien's letters attest the way that he took an active involvement in his children's and his grandchildren's reading habits. So what had Tolkien himself read of modern children's literature? And again, by modern I mean anything from 1850 onwards. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien comments on a variety of modern fairy stories, but he was familiar with many other works of children's literature as well. For instance, in addition to the ones that we'll discuss tonight, he knew the children's story The Silver Trumpet by fellow inkling Owen Barfield, T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone, Ruth Winifred Howe's The Friendly Farm, and Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus. He enjoyed the works of Beatrix Potter, of Lewis Carroll, Edith Nesbit, and Arthur Ransome. And he even shows knowledge of the Borrower's books by Mary Norton, which, given that the first of these was published in 1952, shows that Tolkien maintained a kind of watching brief over the developments of children's literature well beyond the youth of his own children, and did so presumably in part because of his own interest in the genre, as well as for his grandchildren's benefit. His granddaughter Joanna, for instance, recalls that she was handed books to read when she visited her grandparents, and also that Tolkien gave her books on subjects in which she took a particular personal interest. Now, most of these examples are in the category of fantasy, as is reasonably common for children's literature. They're far from being identical types of stories within the fantasy genre. And this shows that even if Tolkien didn't enjoy all that he read, neither did he limit himself narrowly to a single preferred form or style. And the stories that Tolkien shared with his children, as well as the tales he recalled from his own childhood, had an influence on his work. And in some cases, he directly acknowledged these as sources, as with the first of our examples, E.A. Wicksmith's 1927 book, The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. In a letter to W.H. Auden, written in 1955, Tolkien commented that The Marvelous Land of Snurgs was probably an unconscious source book for the hobbits. In Tolkien's own words, an unconscious source book. The fact that Tolkien was unconscious of the book's influence at the time, but became aware of it in later years as he reflected on his own creative process, is important for our approach in considering his sources. Tolkien's own introspection and his recognition of the complex way that his reading could and did shape his creative production shows that our consideration of his source material is not just a wild goose chase. So let's consider the Snurgs and their creator, Edward Augustin Wicksmith. Wicksmith is not a well-known name today. I dare say, has anyone heard of him before this lecture? I thought not. Oh, maybe one, kind of. No, okay. I'm not surprised. Most people have not even heard of The Marvelous Land of Snurgs, let alone read it. The conceit for this story's setting is that the kingdom of the Snurgs is part of our own world, but in some ways isolated from it, so the ship attempting to sail there would find itself pushed away by contrary winds. However, a certain highly intelligent Miss Watkins is able to find a mode of entrance and establish there in the land of the Snurgs an encampment of children who are unwanted. So she cares for them, taking them away from their parents who abandoned them or don't want them, takes care of them in a sort of perpetual summer camp where they soon forget their origins. Miss Watkins and her lady assistants are aided in their care of the children by the kind Snurgs, especially one Gorbo, a foolish but warm-hearted Snurg who rescues the children when they wander off. Snurgs have a great deal in common with hobbits, as Tolkien would come to depict them a few years later. In general, they are gregarious people, loving company, and they're child-sized and long-lived. This is an illustration from The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. We have the child characters, and we have the Snurgs themselves as Gorbo. Like hobbits, Snurgs are enormously fond of food and will find any excuse for a feast, whether it's someone's birthday or the rare occasion of a week with no one's birthday in it. They also have a certain kind of quirkiness of character, which is exemplified in things like their fondness for ceremonial honors, such as the Order of Errant Tinkers and the Order of the Brazen Nutmeg. And this suggests both the civic order of the Shire, in which almost the only duty of the mayor is to preside at banquets, and one of the more comic elements of hobbit life, such as their giving and re-giving of odd mouthings. So we can see then something of what Tolkien meant when he described Wicksmith's book as an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And we can see how Tolkien's creative imagination assimilated and transformed what he read. But it's also interesting to note just the fact that Tolkien liked The Marvelous Land of Smerg so much. Because he did. He was extremely enthusiastic about this book. Now, admittedly, Tolkien's positive response to the Smurfs was not totally unqualified. He adds, "I do not think the name Smurg happily invented, and I do not like the bogus King Arthur land across the river." However, overall, his overall view of the book is strongly positive. In the draft of On Fairy Stories, Tolkien notes, "My own love and my children's love" for the book, and in particular for the Smurg element in the tale, and of Gorbo, the gem of Dunderhead's jewel of a companion in an escapade. Such praise from Tolkien seems surprising for a story that really is the sort of hodgepodge that he thought he saw, and definitely objected to, in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The adventures of Gorbo and the children are a strange mishmash of fairy tale elements and original fantasy. The other characters include the captain and crew of an enchanted Dutch sailing ship, Sir Percival of Arthurian legend, an allegedly reformed child-eating ogre who's tempted to relapse, and an evil witch called Mother Meldrum. And the story's register is also uneven. It moves from a light, genial fantasy to a darker ending, much darker toward the end. For instance, the book includes a rather gruesome description of how Mother Meldrum meets her end by being shot to bits by the Dutch sailors. It's quite unexpectedly gruesome for a book that has been overall pretty lighthearted. Now, we'll return to Tolkien's disapproval of Narnia a little later in the talk, but at present, it's useful to note a few points that may shed some light on his preferences. Tolkien's tastes narrowed over time, and his expressions of dislike became more vehement as he grew older. He read The Marvelous Land of Smerg decades before he encountered Lewis's story, and he did so in the context of sharing it with his children who enjoyed it. And one wonders what his reaction to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe might have been had Lewis written it in the 1930s rather than in the 1950s. Now, in his letter to Auden, Tolkien is careful to note that Wicksmith's book was a source, that insofar as Wicksmith's book was a source, it was for the hobbits themselves, not of anything else. But given the importance that the hobbits would gradually acquire in his imagination, not to mention the imagination of millions of readers around the world in succeeding decades, this one singular adapt to Wicksmith is sufficient all by itself to be of great note. Now, such hard and fast comparisons and connections as we find with The Marvelous Land of Smerg are rare, and perhaps they're most valuable simply in underscoring the fact that Tolkien really did make use of what he read in various ways. And we'll now turn to Kenneth Graham, the author of The Wind in the Willows, published in 1908. And Graham is helpful for our consideration of influence in the broadest sense, insofar as Tolkien's reaction to Graham may have shaped his view on the construction of secondary worlds, or at least provides insights into his views on secondary worlds. Tolkien describes The Wind in the Willows as an excellent book and a delightful picture. He characterizes its down-to-earth, non-dream quality as a correct tone. Having enjoyed the tale, he was eager to read a follow-up book entitled The First Whisper of The Wind in the Willows, which provided letters and early versions of Graham's story. Now, what's particularly interesting about The Wind in the Willows is that it has several notable similarities to Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which Tolkien is famously known to have disliked. Both tales involve a blending of different elements, and both feature intrusion of specifically Greco-Roman mythology in the form of a faun, or the faun-like god Pan. However, although Tolkien dismissed Lewis's tale, he was delighted by Graham's. And so a consideration of Graham's story may shed some light on Tolkien's negative reaction to Narnia, and in that way, his views on how to create a secondary world. It is useful to kind of establish some context. A sort of mythology has grown up about Tolkien's alleged dislike of Narnia, and it has become a little bit exaggerated. Tolkien did not actually know the Narnia books very well at all. He heard The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, or at least the first chapters of it, read aloud in a private meeting with Lewis, rather than reading a manuscript of it for himself. And then, once the subsequent volumes began to be produced, George Sayre, a friend of both of them, reports that Tolkien soon gave up trying to read them. So we don't know what Tolkien heard or read of any of the later Narnia chronicles. We do, however, know that he was willing to have his grandchildren read them. Joanna Tolkien recalls, "When staying with Granny and Grandfather, I was handed from his bookshelf the Narnia books." So we can see that although Tolkien personally, and somewhat regretfully, found the chronicles outside his range of imaginative sympathy, he could and did allow for the possibility that they would appeal to other people. Now, given the exposure that he had, probably just partial, Tolkien concluded that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was a hodgepodge of unrelated elements, that the Narnia Chronicles are anything but a random hodgepodge, that they are in fact very carefully constructed and consistent on a thematic level, has been demonstrated by Lewis scholar Michael Ward, his magisterial book, Plan of Narnia. But Tolkien's reaction is perhaps not surprising, given that in the first Narnia book, we have kind of Edith Nesbit-style modern children, talking animals of the beast fable tradition, fawns from Greco-Roman myth, Father Christmas, and more. Tolkien, not surprisingly, objected to this mixing of different elements. So far, yes, there we go. So far, so good. But if Tolkien's reaction to The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe can be explained by his preference for imaginative coherence, what he called the inner consistency of reality in a sub-created world, how do we account for his love of The Wind and the Willows? As just one example in that book, the size of the animals seems to vary throughout the story. Most of the time, the animal characters seem to be animal-sized. But at one point, Mr. Toad is able to buy and drive an automobile. Not to mention that after he steals a car for a joyride, he is arrested, tried, and jailed in a human court, and then escapes from prison by being dressed up as a washerwoman. So it's, even that element alone, it's wildly inconsistent. And Tolkien himself recognizes that the imaginative world of The Wind and the Willows is far from consistent. In the draft of On Fairy Stories, Tolkien muses on Graham's tale, noting that it is unclassifiable, and describing it as made up of various elements: beast fable, satire, comedy, fairy tale, wild wood, even the rivers of Oxfordshire. And except for the chapter The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Tolkien found this mixture pleasing and describes it as an almost perfect blend of many pigments. So why might Graham's mixing of elements be pleasing to Tolkien, but not Lewis's? And the difference may lie in the fact that The Wind and the Willows seems, at least at first, to be more fully a blend. The elements flow together, and they don't stand out as they do, at least in the opening scenes of the first Narnia book, before we have a chance to see how they fit into Narnia as a whole. Graham does have both human and animal characters, but with the exception of the toad scenes, which are the most satiric, the animals and the humans don't mix, and the human characters are not central, and they're not meant to be taken at all seriously. As Tolkien says, The Wind and the Willows is of course a mixed form, but the washerwoman and the engine driver are really only adjuncts. The story is about a toad, a rat, and a mole. So the blending is of stylistic elements, fable, satire, and comedy, rather than of story elements. The world of The Wind in the Willows is at its heart the river and the wild wood, and the animals' lives in and around those places. There are no magical portals between the animal and the human worlds, and there's no portal between that world and our own world. And in contrast, Narnia features diverse but interconnected worlds with various types of portals from one to the next. And given that Tolkien was so keenly committed to the development of internally consistent secondary worlds, Lewis's approach was probably just not to his taste. And furthermore, Tolkien may simply have liked the elements that Graham used in the story, not least the Oxfordshire landscape, which is lovingly and attentively described, and conversely disliked the elements that Lewis happened to choose for his. The White Witch is very much in the style of Hans Christian Andersen's Snow Queen, and Tolkien, long before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, had been on record as saying he intensely disliked Andersen's stories. Now, a second point of connection between The Wind in the Willows and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that both books feature a goat man, the kind that's called a satyr or a faun in Greek and Roman mythology, respectively. And Graham's chapter, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, features the Greek god Pan, depicted with hooves and curly horns, while Lewis's Mr. Tumnus is in fact specifically described as a faun. And what makes both of these characters slightly edgy for a children's story is that the figure of the satyr in particular, and the faun to a lesser extent, is in their original mythological context associated with sexual promiscuity and sexual violence. And Tolkien finds fault with both Lewis and Graham in this regard. He refers specifically to Mr. Tumnus and his home in mocking comments reported by Roger Lansdowne Green. It really won't do, you know. I mean to say, nymphs and their ways, the love life of a faun. Doesn't Jack know what he's talking about? Jack B. Lewis. So he objects to that. Tolkien's objection to Graham's story, formed long before he ever saw Lewis's manuscript, is similar, although much gentler. Pan has no business here, Tolkien writes, at least not explicit and revealed. So he doesn't object to the character of Pan in principle, or the scene in which Pan is a character in the chapter The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This chapter is in fact tender, gentle, and beautifully written, and Tolkien describes it as a beautiful color in itself. Rather, he dislikes the way that this element, as he put it, muddies the composition as a whole. I personally think that in Pan we have that addition of a little color that spoils the palette. And it's interesting that Tolkien's criticism of Pan is so mild when we consider how much there is in common between The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Wind in the Willows. In The Wind in the Willows, Ratty and Mole come across Pan in their search for a missing baby otter, whom they find curled up asleep, safe and sound, with Pan. In Narnia, Lucy Pevensey goes off happily with Mr. Tumnus and soon finds herself having a very pleasant tea in his cave. Now, admittedly, he's trying to kidnap her and take her to the White Witch, but he soon confesses his intended crime, repents of it, and is forgiven by the tender-hearted Lucy, and he helps her get back through the wardrobe safely. So in both cases, we have a sort of child figure, the baby otter and Lucy Pevensey. We have this child figure interacting with a fawn figure. But there are elements in Graham's scene that give it a different tone than Lewis's scene. In The Wind in the Willows, we see Pan inspiring awe, verging on terror, and also love in Ratty and Mole, so that his character is in tune with the idea of panic that Pan aroused in ancient myth. As Mole looks up, he saw the backward sweep of the curved horns, the stern hooked nose between the kindly eyes that were looking down on them humorously, while the bearded mouth broke into a half-smile in the corners, saw the rippling muscles in the arm that lay across the broad chest, saw the splendid curves of the shaggy limbs disposed in majestic ease on the sward. In The Wind in the Willows, Pan is described in a masculine but not sexual way, and he's even named in the story as friend and helper. Graham's Pan, furthermore, is seen only in relation to the animal characters and doesn't interact with humans at all, let alone in children. And insofar as Pan displays any sort of what we might call animal magnetism, it's appropriate for the animal context. Mr. Tumnus, on the other hand, is portrayed as thoroughly domesticated. He has a snug cave with a carpet, a shelf of books, and a painting of his father over the mantelpiece. He serves a very nice tea with boiled eggs, toast, and cake. He's presented as a perfectly safe companion for a young girl traveling abroad by herself. At any rate, perfectly safe after his confession and repentance, in spite of the fact that fawns are traditionally and irremediably lecherous. And here it's worth noting that the scene includes a slightly jarring note for any adult reader who's also read the classics. When Lucy is looking around Mr. Tumnus's comfortable cave, she notices a door that she thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom. And at this point in the story, it could cause us to wonder, is Mr. Tumnus really as domesticated as he appears? So perhaps Lewis seemed to Tolkien's sensibility to have sort of Bowdlerized or doctored Mr. Tumnus in a way that Graham had largely avoided with Pan. Now, Tolkien might well have better appreciated what Lewis was doing in the sequel, Prince Caspian, which features not just fawns, but Bacchus himself, as that book more fully engages with and resolves the seeming incongruity of pagan sensuality appearing in a children's book, as well as contributing fruitfully to the martial theme of the story. But as I've said, we don't know that Tolkien himself ever read any of the other Narnia books, and if he did, we don't have recorded what he thought about them. Now, a third reason that Tolkien might have objected to the Narnia Chronicles is that he disliked Lewis's more overt presentation of Christianity. Although the Narnia Chronicles are not allegory, they do present Christian ideas far more overtly than Tolkien preferred. For instance, with Aslan as an easily recognizable Christ figure whose sacrificial death and subsequent resurrection are central to the line in which the wardrobe. Lewis makes the connection between the story and Christian belief in the Narnia books much more noticeable than he does, for instance, in Out of the Silent Planet, a book, by the way, which Tolkien thoroughly enjoyed and helped to get published. But the comparison to Graham suggests that it's not the presence of a Christian element that Tolkien disliked, but rather its presentation. And here we should return to Tolkien's comment about The Wind in the Willows, that Pan has no business here, at least not explicit and revealed. Tolkien seems not to have objected in principle to the inclusion of a supernatural element or a divine presence in The Wind in the Willows. Rather, he objects to it being made explicit and revealed. In The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the sense of the numinous builds throughout the chapter. Ratty and Mole approach the island, drawn by music only Ratty hears, and when they arrive, Ratty exclaims, "Here, in this holy place, here if anywhere, surely we shall find him." And when they do find Pan, it's very explicitly a divine presence. Graham writes, "Then the two animals crouching to the earth bowed their heads and did worship." We're told that Pan then gives them the gift of forgetfulness, so that they're able to go on their way without this great haunting memory. And so the supernatural element is, as it were, kind of quarantined to this single chapter of the story. In Tolkien's view, the spiritual or Christian elements of the story should be handled with the greatest degree of indirection and subtlety. He was very keen on having them present. He describes Lord of the Rings as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. but he wanted to do it indirectly, subtly, gently. Even the very brief intrusion of direct contact with transcendence in Graham's work seems to Tolkien almost to spoil the effect of the whole. But as this intrusion is limited to a single chapter, and is in any case very mild, it didn't prevent him from enjoying the book overall. And Tolkien did put his preferences into practice. The Hobbit, and even more so The Lord of the Rings, has deeply Christian themes and echoes, but they're hidden and they're implicit. Now, so far, we've seen an example of a specific influence, identified by Tolkien himself, in the shape of Wick-Smith's nerves. We've also seen how Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, although not a direct influence, gives us insight into what Tolkien valued stylistically in a children's book, and why Tolkien might have made some of the choices he did in writing The Hobbit. I hope that comparing Graham and Lewis has made this clearer. And now let's turn to our fourth source, and to an example of an influence that Tolkien didn't himself specifically identify, but that we can deduce from the evidence. The Dr. Dolittle books of Hugh Lofting were among the children's books that Tolkien enjoyed. Lofting was a contemporary of Tolkien who also fought in the trenches of World War I, and so Tolkien's encounters with his works can come from reading them to his own children. The books feature the eponymous English Dr. John Dolittle, who is led by his great fondness for animals to learn both to understand, and to speak different animal languages. He keeps house with a whole menagerie of friendly animals, and has various adventures on account both of his interest in natural history and his chronic shortage of funds, both of which, by the way, Tolkien would have identified with. The first two books, and the most distinctive for the freshness of the story, are the story of Dr. Dolittle in 1920 and the voyages of Dr. Dolittle in 1922. And I believe that we can trace a connection between the voyages of Dr. Dolittle and a particular scene in The Hobbit. In the voyages of Dr. Dolittle, the boy narrator, Tommy Stubbins, meets the doctor and is invited by him to the house, where they're met at the door by a most unusual housekeeper. Hopping down the stairs on one leg came a spotless white duck, and in her right foot she carried a lighted candle. And here we have an illustration from the book itself. It didn't reproduce as well as it might have done, but here we have the duck housekeeper holding a lighted candle in her webbed foot and coming down to welcome John and Dr. Dolittle. And it turns out that the house is largely run by the animals. Now, they take care of the housework. For instance, while Tommy and the doctor are having a meal, the door is suddenly opened and in march the duck, Dab Dab, and the dog, Jip, dragging sheets and pillowcases behind them over the clean tile floor. The doctor, seeing how surprised Tommy was, explained, "They're just going to air the bedding for me to put on the fire." And this scene is strikingly suggestive of the feast scene in The Hobbit, in which Beorn's animals serve the guests. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly, they got out and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. And ba-ba-ba was heard, and in came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their broad backs trays and bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on the trestle tables. Beside them, a pony pushed two low-seated benches with wide brush bottoms and little short legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Beorn's big black chair. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. Nowhere else in Tolkien's writings, to my knowledge, do we find animal servants like these. The eagles, to be sure, are willing to help others on occasion, but they do so very much in eagle manner, not in imitation human manner like Beorn's animals. And there's another suggestive point in favor of Dr. Dolittle providing some of the inspiration for this scene in Beorn's house. In the draft of The Hobbit, Beorn's original name was Medwed. This has the same rhyming ring to it as many of Lofting's animal characters. Dab Dab the duck, Gub Gub the pig, Toot Toot the owl, and Chi Chi the chimpanzee. And we have, with Tolkien, Medwed the bear. Furthermore, in the final version of The Hobbit, Beorn speaks to the horses in English, as well as speaking to them in a queer language like animal noises turned into talk. And the echo of Dr. Dolittle is even stronger if we look back at the draft and you see Tolkien's phrasings, in which Medwed, Beorn, speaks to his animals in a queer animal language like animal noises turned to talk. Now, if you're just reading The Hobbit, this scene of animal waiters can seem a bit out of place, even a little bit silly, when it's juxtaposed with the increasing seriousness of the story overall. Only a little bit later, The Hobbit includes details such as Beorn displaying the severed head and flayed skin of a captured goblin ward that he dispatched while investigating the dwarves' story. So the animal waiter scene feels a little out of place. But the scene is consistent with the story overall if we remember that The Hobbit had its origins as a tale told to and for Tolkien's own children, who were the ones who also had read or heard read to them the Dr. Dolittle books. If the conceits of the Doctor's animals serving in the house pleased the children, it's quite possible that Tolkien adapted the scene to include this in his own tale for his own children. Now, in this talk, we've considered just a couple, 4 examples of children's literature as possible sources for Tolkien's work, noting that he was well versed in the stories available and that he enjoyed a wide range of styles. We've seen Tolkien himself draw a direct link to the Snurgs of Wixmouth, noting that the marvelous Land of Snurgs was an unconscious source book for The Hobbit. We've discovered that his very positive reaction to Graham's Wind in the Willows illuminates some possible reasons for his famous negative reaction of Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and also gives us some insight into Tolkien's views on the right way to create a secondary world, as well as his views about how overt the spiritual element should be. And we've also seen his very probable debt to Lofting's animal servants for a particular scene in The Hobbit. Each of these kinds of sources is valuable for understanding Tolkien's creative process. What Tolkien read for himself or read to his children very often gave him ideas about what he wanted to do, what he wanted to avoid, or what he wanted to do in a different way, in addition occasionally to providing specific images, themes, or characters that he could adapt. All of these authors whom we've considered provide a fascinating glimpse into this creative process. Tolkien's wide reading in modern literature, of which this is just a tiny little example, his wide reading in modern literature shaped the creation of The Hobbit, and by extension, the second Hobbit, as Tolkien originally called it, or as we now know it, The Lord of the Rings. The range of his source material is greater than is often recognized, and this depth and variety of sources, modern as well as medieval, contributes to the complexity and the richness of his work. And tracing these sources and tracing these influences enhances our own understanding of his work and increases our delight in his marvelous writings. Thank you.